Hey, colonizer, or should I say Zionist? I mean, they're pretty much the exact same thing, right?
We will not reduce ourselves into the victims you so clearly want to make us into to make you feel more comfortable with our existence. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Hot Take with Hila on JTV. Another day, another uninformed TikToker thinking that the world will be improved by their contribution to a discourse that they're too lazy to look up a single fact about. I want to start off this video by saying that bullying anyone for their appearance is childish and unproductive. The person who left that comment was in the wrong. However, Aiden here thought the best way to respond to that hate comment was by being more wrong. And while the person who commented was only wrong according to the opinion that you shouldn't harass people because of the way they look, Aiden was wrong in a very objective, truth-denying, libel-spouting way. Okay, let's get into it, shall we?
Hey, colonizer, or should I say Zionist? I mean, they're pretty much the exact same thing, right?
Yeah, pretty much the same thing if you don't know what words mean. Zionist Definition: a person who believes that the Jewish people have the right to self-determination and self-defense in their indigenous homeland. Colonizer Definition: a person who helps take control of an area or country that is not their own. Now see, the word Jewish literally means of Judea. Contrary to popular belief, the word doesn't necessarily denote religious affiliation, but rather a national origin. It's funny how you seem to have confused an indigenous rights movement with its direct antithesis. More than that, the name Palestine was given to the region of Judea by Roman colonizers. You know, the foreign entity that took control of our land that wasn't theirs and displaced us by means of either genocide or forcing us onto slave ships. Yeah, after the suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt, an indigenous rights movement, if you will, led by Judean warriors in order to take their land back from oppressive, destructive Roman rule, the Roman Emperor Hadrian, may he rot, decided to rename the territory from Judea to Syria Palestina in 135 CE. And this was to completely disconnect Jews from their indigenous homeland of Judea. And here's the kicker. Palestina comes from the Hebrew root polesh, meaning invade. Hadrian literally renamed it invaded land, which must then mean, technically, Palestinian means invader, or, dare I say it, colonizer.
But to remove the ignorance from your mind takes research and hard work that Zionists such as yourself just aren't willing to do.
Is that a challenge? Okay, this is so exciting. So you're gonna say something stupid, and I'm gonna correct it with research and hard work because this Zionist is willing to do it.
I mean, despite the plethora of evidence available online confirming Israel as an apartheid state,
Well, that was easy. But I guess if you want a little more on claims of apartheid and why they're completely unfounded, you can check out my video on the HRW report on the conflict.
and the hours upon hours of footage showing the genocide of the indigenous Palestinian people.
What genocide? Do you even know how many people were killed in the conflict this past year? And how many of those were terrorists or combatants or killed by other Palestinians? You know how many innocent civilians were actually targeted by Israel? None, because Israel doesn't target innocent civilians. Wars are complicated, and unfortunately innocent people get caught in the crossfire. But the idea of targeting rocket launch sites, entrances to terror tunnels, and known Hamas operatives is not a genocide. What is a call to genocide, however, is the Hamas Charter, which clearly says to kill all Jews. Not Zionists. Jews. Compare that with the IDF Code of Ethics, and I challenge you to find evidence of any declared intent of a final solution, so to speak, against Palestinians by Israel. You know what always gets me about this argument? Whenever we're talking about Israel's right to defend itself, someone always brings up the fact that Israel has one of the strongest or most advanced armies in the world. So if we really are one of the strongest and committing a genocide, why are the death counts so low? Don't get me wrong, the loss of even one innocent life is a tragedy, but it isn't genocide. If this so-called genocide is really happening, then why is the Palestinian population of Israel, Gaza, and Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, growing exponentially? That's not how genocides work, my dude. I would know. My family's been through a few. Moving on, the term indigenous Palestinian is literally an oxymoron. You cannot be an indigenous invader. But if you don't believe me that Palestinians aren't indigenous, let's check the UN criteria for indigenous status. I'm using this definition not because I respect the UN in any way, but because it was made by anthropologists and it's the definition that's been accepted by most indigenous communities. Number 1, self-identification as indigenous peoples on the individual level and accepted by the community as their member. Now it's important to look at this wording. Indigeneity is not a title held by an individual, but by a community. The following criteria must apply to the community claiming indigenous status as a whole. If a certain member of the group doesn't know the language or doesn't practice the culture, they are still indigenous if they are accepted as part of the collective by the collective. Now, self-identification is an easy one as it requires no more than a declaration, so let's move on. Number 2, historical continuity with pre-colonial and or pre-settler societies. You know, like how Jews from different diaspora communities can trace their roots back to Judea, or even how the word diaspora in and of itself connotes dispersion, specifically from Judea. There's been no time without Jews since our exiles, so we have pre-colonial continuity. The name Palestine and Palestinians are products of colonialism and therefore not pre-colonial. Also, Arabs didn't get to the land until the 7th century of the Common Era, roughly 500 or 600 years after the Roman exile. Oh, and by the way, the Romans were not the first to colonize us. We also dealt with Babylonian, Persian, and Greek colonizers before them. Also, fun fact, the UN considers any Arab who got to the land as late as 1946 as Palestinian. And they have the audacity to call these people indigenous. This is their criteria. What? The UN being dumb, ineffective, contradictory? Maybe we shouldn't take their resolution seriously. Number 3, strong link to territory and surrounding natural resources. I don't know, maybe if Jews had 7 species of plants that are indigenous to the land of Israel mentioned in our holy book. Maybe if we had pilgrimage festivals where we went to Jerusalem 3 times a year. Or maybe if we had unique agricultural laws like Shemitah, Yovel, Truma, and Meiser that only apply in the land of Israel. Or something like if at the end of major holidays we said next year in Jerusalem and prayed every day 3 times a day facing Jerusalem to return and rebuild our holy temple whose site is currently being occupied and desecrated. Oh wait, someone care to fill me in on an ancient archaeological or historical Palestinian site? Because I've never seen one. More than that, I've never heard of one. There are no ancient Palestinian festivals or holidays that connect them to this land, whereas ours are thousands of years old. I've seen some Palestinians talk about their connection to the olive trees of the land, but that's not really a unique practice. Jews also are extremely connected to olive trees. They're one of our 7 indigenous species. We have an entire holiday about olive oil. It's called Hanukkah. However, did you know that when Arabs came to this land, they burned down our vineyards because wine is prohibited in Islam and replaced them with olive trees? Sounds to me like settler colonialism. Number 4, distinct social, economic, or political systems. You mean something like the Sanhedrin or the Beit Din court system? Maybe how they would work together with a king to rule the land by the laws of Torah, which if you think about it, functions as a book of laws. We even have our own unique currency, the shekel. And what do Palestinians have? Can they name a leader before Arafat? Number 5, distinct language, culture, and beliefs. Hebrew. Judaism, the birth of monotheism. Palestinian language, culture, and beliefs originate from the Arabian Peninsula. Any distinct customs or dialects are comparable to how American culture is slightly different from English culture. That doesn't make Americans indigenous. Number 6, form non-dominant groups of society. Now here's where it gets tricky, so stay with me. Up until 1948, we did form the non-dominant group in that society. It would be ridiculous to claim that indigenous land-back movements working would make those indigenous people no longer indigenous. The reason this is listed as a criteria here is because indigenous status only matters when it comes to the victims of colonization. No one cares that Germans are indigenous to Germany because no one is contesting that claim. So Jews still fit this criteria as people who were subject to colonialism and colonization. And lastly, resolve to maintain and reproduce their ancestral environments and systems as distinctive peoples and communities. Now this would manifest itself in ways like yeshivas, which preserve our methods of study from thousands of years ago, or a national airline that doesn't operate on Shabbat, and having Shabbat as the national day of rest. There's also the option of going to Beit Din instead of civil court. Our ancient indigenous festivals have become our national holidays. We also work to preserve and maintain our holy sites rather than using them as bases to store weapons. Our archaeologists work tirelessly so as not to damage any artifact they may recover, rather than destroying them because they might further prove that Jews are indigenous to this land. I'm currently here at the Temple Mount Sifting Project. About 20 years ago, over 9,000 tons of rubble were disposed of by the Waqf from the Temple Mount. So this group of archaeologists and volunteers work to gather anything of historical importance. This site is just one example of the indigenous Jewish people trying to recover their indigenous artifacts. While we were here, we uncovered pottery, old nails, pieces of metal, mother of pearl, jewelry, glass, and so much more that was all discarded by the Arab Waqf. I'm currently at the city of David, which is the ancient capital of the Kingdom of Israel. It was built by King David, and it overlooks the Arab city of Silwan. Something interesting about Silwan is you can see it's built on top of Jewish burial caves that date all the way back to the First Temple period. And of course, the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque are built on the site of the Temple Mount where the Jewish Holy Temple used to stand. They currently sit on top of the Western Wall, which is the final retaining wall that's left from our Holy Temple. That wall is over 2,000 years old, whereas the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa are roughly 1,400 years old. So what, are the Jewish people so good at colonizing that we managed to get here way before the people you claim are indigenous got here? Also, Israel is one of the only countries in the world that has more trees today than it did 100 years ago. Compare that to sending incendiary balloons to set our fields on fire. Palestinians have the right to live in this land as long-term residents, but they aren't indigenous. Stop pretending they are.
You still wake up every morning and willfully choose to be ignorant. And that's made evident by the fact that you chose to come on my page and attack my appearance not once, but twice.
I mean, no. Again, I don't condone bullying, but 2 comments about your appearance is nothing about your argument. Wait a second, I'm being perceived. That must mean my content has some sort of intrinsic value. No, you're just on the internet.
Now, before you go screaming anti-Semite like every Zionist on the internet.
Ah yes, those darn Jews. They went through a genocide less than a century ago and are currently the most targeted religious group in the United States, but I'm sure you as a Gentile know much more about anti-Semitism than the people who actually face it. Why on earth would you take responsibility for your actions? It's not like there's a name for what you're doing, blood libel, or a set definition, like, I don't know, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, which clearly allows for a legitimate criticism of the state of Israel, but you're not actually criticizing Israel, you're just using it as a cover for your Jew hatred.
Let me make this clear. My issue isn't with Jews, it's with Zionists.
Said every anti-Semite ever. My issue isn't with Jews, it's with giving Jews rights. And yes, I will ignore the fact that over 95% of Jews are Zionists because I look like less of a bigot if I can wave my little tokens around. Longing to return to Zion is a fundamental of Judaism. Telling Jews that they must strip themselves of parts of their identity in order to be more palatable to you is anti-Semitic.
But hoisting the flag of a state actively committing genocide?
Not committing a genocide, but have you ever made that comment to a Chinese person? No? Okay, anti-Semite.
Is going to trigger a lot of people in today's political climate.
Aw, Jews being alive and defending themselves and not living in shtetls where anti-Semites like you can rape and murder us whenever you want is triggering? I don't care. Good. Stay triggered. I hope my existence triggers the likes of you. We will not reduce ourselves into the victims you so clearly want to make us into to make you feel more comfortable with our existence.
I mean, how tone deaf do you have to be to not realize this?
Adolf Hitler, me also rot, was also pretty triggered by our existence, so you sound like the tone deaf one here. Our strength scares you because we're no longer stuck in our shtetls and camps. We are back in our homeland where we fought and continue to fight as mighty warriors. You are scared because you have seen all of our enemies, mighty as their empires were, fade into history while we, the tiny Jew, remain. You are scared because deep down you know the eternity of the Jewish people lies in the gift of the land of Israel and our fight to return home, and we are not going anywhere. And one more thing, cry about it. I'm Hila Oz and you're watching JTV.